What's going on, guys? Sean Nalawani, SeanNal.com, with a nutrition question to go over today. The question being on the importance of breakfast. It's been a pretty standard health and fitness piece of advice for a really long time that you should always start the day off with a proper breakfast because it's going to kickstart your metabolism, it's going to increase muscle growth, and it's something that you need for proper health and functioning throughout the day. So let's take a look at this topic from three different angles: fat loss, muscle building, and overall health. And then you can decide on what sort of morning nutrition approach is right for you. Before I dive into the video, guys, if you do enjoy this content, make sure to hit the subscribe button below to stay up to date on all of my future videos, and click the little bell symbol beside it as well, and that way you'll be notified whenever a new video is available so you don't miss out on anything. So the first issue is breakfast and fat loss. We know that the most important factor by far when it comes to losing body fat is that you need to create a calorie deficit by burning more calories than you consume on a consistent basis. So for breakfast to increase fat loss, it would need to somehow improve your net energy balance in the big picture. And for years, people have been saying that eating breakfast increases your metabolism, that if you don't eat breakfast, your body's going to go into starvation mode, your metabolism is going to slow down, and you won't burn as much fat. However, if we look at the actual research behind this, and also just tons of anecdotal evidence from people who use intermittent fasting or similar types of approaches where breakfast is skipped, it really doesn't look like breakfast has any special fat burning benefits. Eating breakfast technically does increase your metabolism, but that happens anytime you eat a meal, and there isn't some greater increase that you're going to get specifically by eating in the morning. Most of the research on meal frequency pretty much points to the idea that as long as your total calories for the day are the same, it really doesn't matter how you space your meals out in terms of losing fat. Basal metabolic rate and the thermic effect of food stay the same, and that's whether you eat 2 big meals, 4 medium-sized meals, or 6 small meals, and it's regardless of how you space them. So whether you eat a higher percentage of your calories earlier on in the day or later on in the day, like a lot of people do with intermittent fasting. Now, some people will say that skipping breakfast is a bad idea because it'll increase your hunger and cause you to eat more later on. And yeah, as a general rule, if you don't eat breakfast, then you're probably naturally going to eat more calories in that later portion of the day. But studies have shown that overall, and there will always be individual differences, of course, but overall, even though calories tend to increase later on in people who skip breakfast, they still end up eating fewer calories for the day as a whole. And one study showed that if you take people who regularly don't eat breakfast and then require them to start eating breakfast, they usually end up gaining weight. And I'll link that study and any other research that I mentioned in this video in the description box below. But the bottom line on breakfast and fat loss is that given equal calorie intake for the day, it most likely makes no noticeable difference whether you eat right after waking up or if you push your first meal until later on, whether that's just by a couple hours or by a much longer period of up to 6 to 8 hours or more, like people do with intermittent fasting. And in a lot of people, skipping breakfast actually has a positive effect on controlling appetite and on reducing calorie intake for the day as a whole once their body adapts to it. So if you are having issues with hunger while cutting, that is something that you can optionally experiment with. Now, the second question is on the issue of muscle growth. And we've all heard the idea that you need to eat every 2 to 3 hours throughout the day or else you're going to go catabolic and lose all of your gains. And a lot of us recommended and followed that approach in the past, myself included. Fortunately, we know now that it takes a lot longer than 3 hours for muscle breakdown to actually become a real issue. As long as total protein synthesis for the day as a whole exceeds protein breakdown, which is known as your protein turnover rate, then you're going to gain muscle. And that's why, and I don't think there's anything special about intermittent fasting, by the way. It's one option to use out of many, but it's just a good example to use on this whole breakfast topic. That's why even people using intermittent fasting can still gain muscle effectively and increase their strength and so on, even though they're not eating for the first 8 hours of the day. So can you gain muscle effectively without eating breakfast? Yes, obviously that's pretty clear that you can. And as long as your nutrition for the day as a whole is on point, you're getting enough total calories and protein, and you're breaking it up into 2 and preferably 3 separate feedings, yes, you'll still gain muscle effectively as long as your training is also on point. However, I am going to give 2 caveats on this. The first is that if your goal is to fully maximize muscle growth to your full potential, then I wouldn't say that fasting for a large portion of the day is going to be ideal. The difference will probably be pretty small overall, but for optimal muscle building results, I'd say to at least get some protein in within a few hours of waking up rather than spending the entire first half of the day in a totally fasted state. And the second is related to strength and energy levels, because training in a completely fasted state can negatively impact peak training performance. In other words, if you're performing a maximum effort weight training session and you want to put up the biggest numbers possible, going at it on a completely empty stomach is probably not going to be your best choice. Getting in some protein and some carbs within 1 to about 2.5 hours pre-workout, that would probably be ideal. And if you are still going to go ahead and train fasted regardless, then I would recommend that you get in at least around 20 grams of protein or so within a couple hours of finishing your workout, rather than training on a completely empty stomach and then continuing to fast for another 5 or 6 hours or more. Now, again, remember that those two caveats are about fully maximizing your results. I can't say just how big the difference would be. It's going to vary from person to person. You can still get great results even if you ignore this, but those factors should be considered if you want to be fully on the safe side in terms of maximizing your gains. And then lastly is the issue of breakfast and overall health. So a few observational studies have shown that people who eat breakfast are generally healthier than non-breakfast eaters. And that creates the impression that eating breakfast must be healthier. But it's important to keep in mind that these types of studies only look at correlation and not at direct causation. So most likely, it's not that people are healthier because they eat breakfast. It's more likely that the type of person who would just naturally be eating a healthier diet and exercising regularly is also the type of person who's going to be following traditional health and fitness advice, which includes not skipping breakfast. Whereas people who do skip breakfast are more likely going to be the types who are leading a generally unhealthier lifestyle, again, on average. So people aren't healthy because they eat breakfast, they're healthy in spite of the fact that they eat breakfast. And actually, some studies have even shown that pushing your first meal until later on can even have certain health benefits, like decreasing inflammation, lowering blood pressure, and improving cardiovascular health. And also that populations who do fast regularly tend to live longer and are healthier overall. I don't know just how significant those health effects are. It's something that, or it's not something that I've done a ton of research into, but the central point here is that there's no real reason to assume that breakfast is healthy in any specific way, or that skipping breakfast is going to have a negative impact on health markers. And actually, the actual statement that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, that was actually created by Kellogg's to promote their breakfast cereals back in the early 1900s. So that statement itself is just based on advertising and not on any real science to begin with. So what's the bottom line on all of this? The bottom line is that the decision to eat breakfast or not eat breakfast is mostly just a matter of personal preference, and you can just make the decision for yourself based on your individual appetite, your energy levels, your daily schedule, your fitness goals, and on what's most convenient for you. Just know what your total nutritional needs are for the day as a whole to support your goals, and then lay it out in the way that you most prefer and in the way that will be easiest to stick to, because the vast majority of your results are going to be determined by your total calorie and total macronutrient intake in the bigger picture. Some people find that delaying their first meal until the afternoon is helpful for controlling appetite, which makes it easier to stick to their diet. And others, like myself, prefer to just wake up and eat a regular breakfast right after waking up. Ultimately, you just have to test it out and see for yourself what works best. Again, the only caveat to take into account, like I mentioned before, is for those who are trying to fully maximize muscle growth and fully maximize performance 100%. In that case, fasting for a prolonged period of the day probably isn't ideal, and training fasted in the morning without a post-workout meal, that's probably not going to be ideal either. But again, even the difference there is probably minor overall, so you can just weigh it out for yourself based on that. So I hope this was helpful, guys. If you appreciate this science-based, no BS approach to fitness, and you want to get a complete step-by-step roadmap for gaining muscle and losing fat as effectively as possible, the workouts, meal plans, supplement guides, along with one-on-one coaching, then you can grab my body transformation blueprint by clicking here, or by heading over to btblueprint.com using the link in the description box. If you enjoyed the video, as always, make sure to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to stay up to date on future videos. You can also check out my official blog over at SeanNall.com for all of my latest updates, and you can follow me on Facebook and Instagram as well if you aren't already. The links for that are also in the description box below. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll talk to you again soon.